Δόξα σοι το δείξαντι το φως, δόξα εν ύψης της Θεόν, και επί γης ειρήνη, εν ανθρώπης ευδοκία.
Τιμούμεν σε, ευλογούμεν σε, προσκυνούμεν σε, δοξολογούμεν σε, ευχαριστούμεν σοι, για την μεγάλη σου δόξα.
Κύριε βασιλεύ, εκ ουράνιεσθε, Πάτερ παντοκράτορ, Κύριε Ιε μονογενές, Ιησού Χριστέ και Άγιον Πνεύμα. Άγιος ο Θεός, Άγιος ισχυρός, Άγιος αθάνατος ελέησον ημάς.
Δόξα Πατρί και Υιός και Αγίο Πνεύματι,
Και αεί και εις τους αιώνας των αιώνων. Αμήν.
Άγιος αθάνατος ελέησον ημάς.
Hi, welcome to The Inner Way, a program exploring the spirituality of the Orthodox Church. I'm your host, Father David Smith. This is our second program, and in this opening series, I want to explain why I named the video series The Inner Way. This will be the subject of the first 4 programs, maybe 5 programs, all of them entitled Why the Inner Way. When we consider the subject of Orthodox spirituality, we have to remember the focal point of our spiritual lives, who is Jesus Christ, but liturgically speaking, is the Divine Liturgy. As Father Irene Steenberg says, the shape and reality of Orthodox belief comes from the Divine Liturgy. In terms of the services of the church, it's the centerpiece. In terms of our spiritual lives, it's the place where everything comes together. It's the fuel, the floor, the fire of our spiritual lives. So anything I say about the inner way is built on the foundation of the church and the Divine Liturgy, just to be clear at the beginning. But when I say that the foundation of faith is the church and the liturgy, it's important to pause to reflect on the way people experience the Divine Liturgy. Most of the time, I'm afraid, they have no idea why the liturgy is important. I spoke in the first program about those who told me they attend the Divine Liturgy because it makes them feel good. I often hear another reason as well. People say that the liturgy is important because it's the place we receive Holy Communion. In fact, almost all of the serious Christians I speak with express, to varying degrees, that particular belief. But a problem emerges when one considers the essential element of the Divine Liturgy to be Holy Communion. Yes, it's the culmination of the service. It's the sacramental part of the sacrament. But when the liturgy is considered to consist mainly of Holy Communion, we may find ourselves falling into a reductionist mentality. That is to say, if Holy Communion is the reason one attends the liturgy, the rest of the liturgy, the opening prayers, the scripture readings, and so on, may be seen as less important. I can prove that this happens. Look at the number of people who consider Holy Communion to be very important in their lives, and yet they arrive at the Divine Liturgy late. Why do they consider it acceptable to arrive late, especially when the church genuinely means so much to them. These are people who respect the church, but they come late to the divine liturgy. It's because the opening exclamation, the great ectania, the small entrance, and so on, are not the centerpiece. Those parts can be missed without Holy Communion losing any of its power. This is what they believe. Therefore, the divine liturgy serves its purpose for those who are not present for all of it. Some Christian churches have even institutionalized this attitude by reducing the text of the divine liturgy to, well, what they consider to be its essential element, Holy Communion. This can and will not be satisfactory for you or for me. How do we resist this tendency, this inclination, which is very insidious? I found that some who convert to the Orthodox faith, who embody a great love and commitment to the church, start coming to the divine liturgy a little, then a little more, and more later over time, late. I call it tardy creep. It sneaks up on someone who doesn't understand why the divine liturgy is important and who looks around and says, well, everybody else is late. I guess I should be too. So let's ask ourselves today, why is the divine liturgy essential to our spiritual lives? Holy Communion is important. The scriptures in the sermon are important, as are the prayers. But all of this can be described with one word: worship. Worship is the essential element of the divine liturgy. There are many ways to look at and reflect on worship, and during the course of this video series, we'll return often to the subject. But today, I want to look to some verses from one particular psalm, Psalm 70, 71 in Protestant Bibles, as a way of answering the question, how can we keep ourselves centered on worship when we attend the divine liturgy? The Psalms do not comprise a treatise on or instructions of how to properly worship. They are themselves one aspect of worship. We use them to worship, but in so doing, we also can use them to learn how and why God wants us to worship. From the 70th Psalm, I'm using the translation from Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston. It goes like this: In thee continually is my singing of praise. I am become as a wonder to many, and thou art my strong helper. Let my mouth be filled with thy praise, that I may hymn thy glory and thy majesty all the day long. Now, what does the thousands of years of people using these words as part of their worship of God tell us? First, that worship is primarily the act of dwelling in God, and this is accomplished by singing his praise, that I may hymn thy glory and thy majesty all the day long. Would anyone chant this psalm all day long? Perhaps, but it's very unlikely. I wouldn't do that, and neither would you. So what does it mean when it says, hymn thy glory and thy majesty all day long? It means that worship puts us into the presence of God. I might even say, puts us into God. And when we stop worship, when we walk out of the door and get into our cars to go home, the worship we have done puts us in a position to continually worship him, even not in the church, but in the world. This is worship, abiding in the presence of God. Secondly, these verses from Psalm 70 teach us that worship is a kind of witness to the world of the goodness of knowing God. I am become as a wonder to many, and thou art my strong helper. That is to say, when we worship, we do not only serve ourselves, but we become advertisements for God. We speak the truth about God in worship and thereby teach the world who God is. He is our strong helper. People around us might miss that, so we say it, we sing it in our worship. We become a wonder to many because they hear us praising God, and this arouses curiosity in some, and they seek to know more. Another passage from the 70th Psalm. My mouth shall declare thy righteousness, all the day long thy salvation, for I know not the reckoning thereof. I will commence in the might of the Lord. O Lord, I will make mention of the righteousness which is thine alone. Again, what does the thousands of years of people using these words as part of their worship of God tell us? First, that there is always an element of worship which we do not understand, for I know not the reckoning thereof. But God has told us how to worship, and when we follow His instructions, we are ushered into His glory. I use as an example the long 8th chapter of the Old Testament book of Numbers. It's one of the longest chapters in the Bible, and if you read even a small part, you'll understand why. The book carefully, painstakingly describes the offerings to the temple of each of the 12 tribes. Each tribe knew what they were supposed to do, and each followed the instructions of God precisely, given through Moses. And what was the result? The last verse, Numbers chapter 8, verse 89 says, Now when Moses went into the tabernacle of meeting to speak with him, he heard the voice of one speaking to him from above the mercy seat that was in the ark of testimony, from between the two cherubim. Thus he spoke to him. In other words, the tabernacle had become the place of the presence of God. Why did we have to go through this long, repetitive process to lead up to this verse? That's not a question for us to ask or answer. It's only for us to follow the commandments of God and worship Him according to His instructions and His divine will. This is a critical point about worship that we're going to address in subsequent programs. Worship is not determined and composed by human beings. It is given by God and by Him alone. Secondly, these verses from Psalm 70 teach us that we do not worship anyone or anything else besides God. I will make mention of the righteousness which is thine alone. What does the word worship mean, historically speaking? It's an Old English word. It means to attribute worth to something. I gave a speech one time at a gathering in London, Ontario, this forum kind of a thing, where the mayor was present. I called the mayor's office beforehand to ask what form of address to use, and can you guess what they told me? The proper address for a mayor is your worship. Like we call a bishop your grace or an archbishop your eminence, you call a mayor in the British Commonwealth, or at least in Canada, your worship. Should I have used such a title of address? Wouldn't that, violate biblical norms? That worship is reserved for God alone. I thought initially of withdrawing my agreement to participate in the forum, but then I changed my mind. Of course I used the title when I delivered my speech, but not because I worshipped the mayor the same way I worshipped God, or worship God. Rather, I understood that the term reflects the worthiness of the person who occupies such a public office, and therefore it's political, not liturgical. But this offers us some insight into the phrase, I will make mention of the righteousness which is thine alone. If worship can be given, even must be given, to other entities beside God alone, then we must constantly monitor ourselves so that we do not allow political worship to become liturgical or spiritual or theological worship. Not just political worship, but also entertainment worship, sports worship, intellectual worship. It shocks us to think that we could embrace something shallow and endow it with a worthiness that rivals our attitude toward God. But doesn't this happen? Doesn't this happen in our culture? And not rarely. One more quotation. Thou hast multiplied thy magnificence over me, and having returned thou hast comforted me, and out of the depths of the earth again thou broughtest me up. What does the thousands of years of people using these words as part of their worship of God tell us? Listen, we are brought low by sin and human nature, but worship comforts us and lifts us up. This is the inner way of the divine liturgy. This is interior worship. So we begin our journey with this. The divine liturgy, the ecclesial centerpiece of our spiritual lives, is first and foremost an act of worship. There are external realities associated with the divine liturgy, but the interior realities are just as important. Would you attend a divine liturgy at which the priest dressed in blue jeans and a t-shirt? Not more than once, I imagine. So why attend a divine liturgy where your interior heart and mind is similarly inappropriately clothed? We must understand this to be equally as outrageous. Brothers and sisters, today we continue our journey, the journey of walking the inner way. Let us prepare ourselves not only by attending the divine liturgy, but also attending to the divine liturgy for the salvation of our souls. See you in church.